The wind on Halsas did not whisper. It screamed. Nayli's cloak flared uselessly behind her as the ice storm descended from the ridgelines like a starving beast. The landscape around her was dissolving, the snow falling so thick it blurred all shape and form into a blank, suffocating void. She ran after the last shadow of the expedition shuttle, her boots skidding across the frozen ground, her voice rising in desperation. They didn't stop. The lights on the tail stabilizer flickered once, then vanished into the white, swallowed hole by the blizzard. Nayli stumbled forward another few steps before her knees gave out. Her gloved hands struck the snow, trembling. She screamed their names, screamed until her throat burned and her voice cracked. No reply came, only the shrill wail of wind and the distant groan of ice shifting beneath the crust of the world. Her comms unit hissed with static. The beacon signal she'd set up hours earlier pulsed a useless rhythm, ignored. She stared at it, blinking tears that froze before they touched her cheeks. Her team had left her. They had said it gently, with the cruel kindness of the pragmatic. The storm front was coming faster than forecast. The rover couldn't carry them all, her fever had spiked, and her body was too weak to risk the rest. She had argued, she had pleaded, and in the end, she had begged. They'd nodded, told her someone would return. But she'd seen it in their eyes, the truth they didn't say. No one was coming back. So Nayli built a shelter the way a drowning person builds a prayer, desperate, trembling, clinging to anything that might keep her alive one more night. She huddled beneath a dome of ice blocks, sealed by frozen hands, and cried into the storm. The snow answered with silence. The first night she sobbed until exhaustion claimed her. By the second, the sobs became whispers. By the third, they became a ritual, a soundless cry to the sky. The storm did not pass. Day and night meant little on Halsas. The sun never fully broke through the heavy atmosphere, and its pale light drifted through the clouds like the memory of warmth. But Nayli kept count, scratched lines into the frozen inner wall of her shelter with the tip of a broken sampling tool. 30 notches now. 30 cycles since her abandonment. She stopped calling for help after the first 10. Her voice had given out. Then the comm unit failed, first losing outbound frequency, then power. The beacon went silent. There was nothing left to do but wait. The heater's fuel was long gone. The emergency rations depleted. She had managed to melt ice for water using body heat and a salvaged solar pack, but even that grew harder as the panels glazed over with frost. Her limbs had thinned. Her eyes sunk deep into her face. But her mind, somehow, remained sharp. Nayli had always been analytical. She cataloged her decline with clinical clarity: muscle loss, early nerve fatigue, visual degradation, hearing slightly impaired from cold exposure. Her thoughts were slower now. She forgot words sometimes, but she remembered what mattered. She remembered that she had cried out for 30 days, and no one had come. Until today, it was faint. A vibration in the ground, not natural, not wind, not ice, a hum. She pressed her ear against the snow floor. Breath hitching, engines, a low grumbling frequency, something cutting through the storm. Nayli fumbled to her feet and crawled to the narrow slit she used to peer outside. Her breath fogged the view, but through it she saw a shadow moving, angular, mechanical, steady. Not Elloran design. The edges were rugged, industrial, Terran. Her fingers reached out through the slit and she screamed, not with despair, not with pain, but with the last, thin thread of hope that hadn't died. The machine came closer. The snow parted, and from the haze emerged a rover, headlights piercing the blizzard, crawling like a beast of burden through the wrath of the world. Inside, someone saw her and turned toward her. The rover's door hissed open, and heat spilled into the storm like a miracle. The wind screamed its protest, trying to snatch it back, but the figure who stepped out was already moving fast. Heavy insulated boots crunched against the snow as Dr. Eliam Kane adjusted his visor and sprinted toward the crumbling dome. The life sign signal had been faint, buried under interference and a snow depth that suggested a grave rather than a shelter. He hadn't believed it at first, just another dying frequency on a dead planet. But something about the voice in the data packet wouldn't let him ignore it. A cracked whisper, not automated, not scripted, something pleading. And now, in front of him, there was no doubt. He dropped to one knee outside the collapsed edge of the shelter, peering in. At first, all he saw was frost. Then movement. Slow, weak, a trembling arm. I see you, he said, voice calm but urgent. I'm here. She couldn't answer. Her lips were moving, but her throat gave no sound. Still, she didn't look away. Her violet eyes locked onto his through the fractured opening. Eliam cut away the ice blocks with a portable thermal blade. The dome gave in with a reluctant groan, and he climbed in, kneeling beside her, already scanning her vitals. Skin temperature at critical lows, dehydrated, starving, ribs prominent, respiratory system erratic, but still viable. She was Xerelian. He hadn't treated one in years, but their physiology came back to him. Dual-lobed hearts, slow cellular metabolism, high fluid retention. It was a miracle she'd lasted 30 days out here. A miracle and pure, furious will. I'm gonna lift you, he said. Try to stay awake. Her eyes fluttered, but she nodded once. He carried her to the rover wrapped in thermal blankets, whispering calm reassurances he wasn't sure she understood. Inside, the warmth wrapped around her like a living thing. She flinched at first, as if her skin had forgotten what comfort was. He laid her on the medbed, began hooking up nutrient infusions, temperature stabilization, oxygen. Her breathing hitched once, then steadied. Her eyes fluttered shut, but not in unconsciousness. This time it was something else, relief. Eliam sat beside her, scanning her again to be sure. 30 days, he muttered to himself. God, you shouldn't be alive. But she was, and somehow she had waited for him. When Niley woke again, it was to a low hum beneath her. Warmth surrounded her, not the cold, flickering kind she had clung to for weeks, but real warmth, steady and alive. The walls were smooth metal, not ice. The lights overhead were soft, golden, unlike the pale blue of her shelter's emergency beacon. She turned her head and saw him. The human. He was seated in the corner, head tilted back against the bulkhead, breathing slow and even. A small heating module beside him glowed faintly. He looked worn down by time, his features marked by the kind of tiredness that never quite leaves, deep under-eye circles, weather-bitten skin, hair tousled by days of work. She studied him for a long time before whispering, "You heard me." His eyes opened at once. He stood and crossed the room, the edges of concern softening into something gentler. "You're awake. Good." He checked her vitals. "How do you feel?" She tried to speak again, but her voice cracked. "I have water." He offered her a cup. She drank slowly, carefully, eyes never leaving his. "I cried," she said after a moment, her voice dry and brittle. 30 days. No one came." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "Not your fault." He sat beside the bed, elbows resting on his knees. "I'm Eliam Kane, medic, stationed alone on the southern ridge. Your signal, it barely came through, but I tracked it." "Naley," she whispered. "Xenobiologist, Expedition 7. A pause. "They left me." Eliam didn't ask why. He didn't need to. The look in her eyes, the weight of her words, he'd seen that same emptiness in refugee camps during the war, in the aftermath of bombings, in the quiet of triage tents where no one had come back for the ones too broken to run. "You kept crying," he said, "even when you knew no one was listening." She looked at him and her lip trembled, but she didn't cry now. She'd already spent a month crying. Now she was hollow, a shell clinging to the faint idea of worth. "I didn't want to vanish," she whispered. "You didn't." Eliam reached for her hand, cautious. She didn't pull away. "You're here," he said. "You're heard, and you're not alone anymore." The storm outside still raged, but its voice no longer owned her. The wind was just sound now, and in the cabin of the rover, in the warmth of another soul, Naley began, for the first time in 30 days, to believe she might live. The rover carried them across the frozen plains of Halsís, its reinforced frame groaning under the strain of the wind. Outside, the storm clawed at the world like it had been personally insulted by the survival of one fragile body. But inside, a new rhythm began to form, gentle, strange, and laced with silence that no longer suffocated. Naley remained in the medical bed, her limbs carefully swaddled in warming wraps, every motion monitored by the rover's basic life support system. Eliam checked her hourly, rarely straying far from her side, scribbling notes into his datapad, recording readings, and muttering theories to himself. She watched him. She had been watched before, on operating tables, under scanners and academic reviews, but never like this. This man didn't study her. He guarded her. His kindness was subtle. He didn't speak much, and when he did, his voice was plain, quiet, nothing like the lyrical tones of her people. But he moved around her with the precision of someone who had learned too well, what it meant to lose patience. Every cup of water was warmed just right. Every movement near her was slow, deliberate, respectful. He even adjusted the light so the brightness wouldn't jar her. Nellie found herself whispering again. Little pieces of her history. Small truths, scattered between moments of silence. "I was supposed to be on leave after the survey," she said one night as he sat beside her bed, eating from a ration pouch. "I had saved every approval credit for a cycle on Siloris. Warm rain, music." He looked up, the corners of his mouth tilting faintly. "That's the pink jungle planet, right? Real plants look like watercolors." "Yes," she murmured. "I wanted to dance barefoot in warm soil. Instead, I wept in ice." Liam set the pouch aside. "You'll dance again." She blinked at him, stunned by the simplicity of it. It wasn't a promise, just a certainty. A few hours later, as he calibrated the rover's stabilizers, she turned toward him, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "Why did you come?" He paused, hands stilling over the control panel. The question floated in the air between them. "Because no one else did." Nellie said nothing. But in that moment, she began to believe in something she had long forgotten. That her life was worth saving, even if no one stood to profit from it. When the rover finally reached the southern outpost, the sky above had begun to clear. The storm was dying, beaten not by any force of technology, but by time and stubborn endurance. The jagged spires of ice that once loomed like silent executioners now gleamed beneath fractured starlight. Outpost Theta 7 was modest, built for one. A narrow corridor of reinforced alloy embedded into a cliffside half buried in snow. Liam keyed in the access code, and the door hissed open, flooding them with regulated warmth. He carried Nellie inside, carefully shifting her to the reclining bed in the med chamber. She didn't speak. Her energy was still faint, her body still delicate, but her eyes followed every movement. He activated the sterilizers, adjusted the humidity, recalibrated oxygen density, and unpacked nutrient modules with quiet precision. Nellie watched, lips barely parted. "You live here, alone?" Liam nodded. "I prefer silence, most of the time." "Why?" He paused before answering, hands still over the nutrient prep station. "Because silence doesn't abandon you." Nellie understood that too well. Over the next few days, she began to regain color. Her muscles trembled when she moved her arms, but she could sit upright now, take solid food, speak without coughing. Her voice, melodic and soft, carried stories he hadn't expected. About the moons of Zurel, where she had danced on silver bridges of glass. About learning physics in a suspended coral city. About laughing underwater. In turn, Iliam offered bits of his own past. A medic during the Glasson conflicts. A brother lost. A mission failed. After the war, he had sought out the quiet corners of the galaxy, places where he could do good without answering to indifferent commands. "You saved me," she whispered one evening, staring at the ceiling, the lights dimmed to a gentle dusk glow. "You saved yourself," he replied. "I just made sure you didn't stop." "I cried for 30 days, she said, more to herself than to him. "No one should cry that long and survive." He turned to her, face unreadable for a long moment. "Then maybe you cried long enough for both of us." Nellie closed her eyes, and in that silence, not the silence of the storm, not the silence of abandonment, but a living, breathing silence, something fragile and warm stirred between them. Not healing, not yet, but the beginning of it. The ice had begun to melt, not outside where the temperature still fell well below freezing, but within her. Nellie could feel it as she sat upright in the recovery chamber, draped in thermoweave, her hair slowly regaining its natural luster, no longer brittle from frost. Her limbs had started responding more consistently. The nerve regrowth serum was doing its work, aided by Iliam's improvised modifications to her physiology, adjustments he'd carefully mapped against Zurelian anatomy guides and adapted with an obsessive precision born from experience and stubbornness. The man never stopped moving. If she blinked too long, he was across the room reconfiguring the environment settings or checking the atmospheric filters or recalibrating the heating thresholds. His hands bore the marks of someone who had lived more years in war zones and wilderness than in cities. Every callus had a history. Every scar, a story he never told unless she asked directly. That morning, as pale light from the cracked atmosphere filtered through the observation window, Nellie asked the question that had been on her tongue for days. "Why did you really come for me?" Ilium was seated at the terminal, reviewing vitals. He paused, not looking at her. "I told you. I heard your distress call." She shook her head slowly. No one responds to a 30-day-old distress call unless they've lost someone too. He didn't speak for a while, just stared at the screen as if it might answer for him. Then he turned, his expression unreadable, but the edges of his voice dulled by memory. "My sister, Nira, she was a medic too, posted on Jarathi. Their outpost went dark during a magnetic storm. No one sent help. Too far, too costly. She broadcast for 25 days before the signal died." Nelly felt something twist in her chest, deep and quiet. "I got there on day 32, he continued. "Too late. All I found was static and bones. I stayed. Buried her myself. Swore if I ever heard another voice like that, I wouldn't wait." She didn't know what to say. Words would have felt cheap, so she simply sat there, absorbing the weight of what he'd carried into the storm with him. When she reached out, her hand trembled slightly, but she touched his. "Then she brought you to me," she said softly. He looked at her, and in that single glance, the air between them changed. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. But it was real. It was connection. Recognition. Something neither of them had expected to find here, at the edge of the galaxy, buried beneath snow and silence. By afternoon, Nelly stood. It took both of them, his arms braced against hers, her legs weak as reeds in winter wind, but she stood. The tremor in her knees didn't stop her. The ache in her spine didn't stop her. Her hand clenched around his shoulder like a lifeline. One step, then another. By the time she made it to the edge of the med chamber, her breath was ragged, but her eyes were alive with fire. Ilium grinned, not wide, but real. "Didn't I say you'd dance again?" She smirked through the exhaustion. "Give me 2 more days and a proper floor, and I'll make the snow blush." For the first time, he laughed. Not the tight, ironic chuckle she'd heard before, but a full, honest sound that filled the room like sunlight. Something had shifted, not just in her body, but in both of them. Something had begun. The next 2 days passed in the rhythm of healing and building, of shared silence and sudden laughter. Nelly was walking now, halting steps that still needed Ilium's steadying presence, but steps nonetheless. The outpost became less of a clinic and more of a cocoon, a place suspended in time, where neither of them quite belonged to the world they had come from anymore. They shared meals across a narrow steel table, trading stories like old soldiers. Ilium spoke of the medical ship that dropped him here, how the brass called it a voluntary sabbatical, to avoid dealing with his complaints about chain-of-command callousness. Nelly told him about her years among stars, how the Jarelian fleets moved like constellations across the void, and how science, pure knowledge, had once been enough for her. Not anymore. Now, it was about people. He'd taught her that, simply by showing up. One night, as the wind howled against the reinforced walls, Nelly stood in the corridor outside the med bay, her bare feet pressing into the warm surface panels. Her legs ached, but the pain felt good. It reminded her that she had a body again, that she wasn't a ghost in a cave. She leaned her head against the cold window and watched snow swirl in a dance of white fury. She didn't hear Ilium approach, but she felt him when he stopped beside her. "They'll be looking for you eventually," he said. She nodded. "They think I'm dead. Are you going to prove them wrong?" She hesitated. "I don't know," she whispered. "Part of me wants to go back, show them what they left behind, make them face what they did. And the other part?" She turned to look at him. Her expression was unreadable, fierce and soft at once. "The other part wants to forget them and stay here." He held her gaze, and something passed between them, something that needed no voice. "You have that choice," he said. "This place is quiet. The galaxy doesn't knock often." She smiled faintly. "But sometimes it listens." There was another silence, not uncomfortable, just still. She reached for his hand again, not asking, just finding it. He didn't flinch. He let her take it. "I heard you," she said quietly, "long before you arrived. I think part of me knew someone was coming." Ilium's thumb brushed over her knuckles, slow and careful. Not a promise, not yet, but something close. Outside, the storm continued its endless march, but it no longer owned her. And deep within the outpost, surrounded by metal and frost and breathless possibility, Nelly stood taller than she had in 30 days. Alive. Seen, and finally unafraid. By the 12th day, Nelly walked on her own. Not gracefully, not for long stretches, but without help and with her head high. Ilium watched her from the observation bench, pretending to review datapads, but his eyes followed every movement. She moved like a survivor, not a patient. Her strides bore the stiffness of someone who'd learned how to walk twice, once in youth, once in agony. Her body was healing faster than either of them anticipated. Her mind was slower to follow. Ilium noticed it in the way she hesitated before reaching for certain things. The brief flickers of anxiety that crossed her face when she heard the wind against the metal walls. The cold dread that still passed through her every time the outpost lights flickered. It was always in her eyes first. A shadow of the 30 days she'd spent alone in the storm, crying to a sky that had no ears. But she was no longer crying. She was calculating, watching, rebuilding. Nayli spent more time in the systems room, where the communications arrays were located. Her hands moved with methodical grace, adapting the Terran interface to Zarelian command code. She didn't speak much while she worked, but Ilium could feel her intent. She was tracing her old broadcast path, looking at who ignored her, where the silence had come from, whether her people had ever truly tried to reach her. He didn't intrude. He knew what it meant to dig through silence looking for betrayal. But when she finally found it, the silence between them broke. "I found the logs," she said one evening, standing in the doorway of his chamber. Her eyes were dry. Her tone was factual. "They received my signal. Day 6, they locked it, buried it under a low-priority archive. The mission commander flagged it as resource risk." Pus. Ilium didn't need her to explain. They had deemed her unworthy of rescue, not dead, just not worth the cost. He stood and crossed the room to her. "I'm sorry," he said. She nodded once, and for the first time since he met her, she looked angry. Not the cold, frozen grief she had carried like armor, but fury, red and trembling, held in check only by the thinnest thread of control. "I want to send them something," she said. "Not a message, not a report. Proof. I want them to see what I am now, what they left behind." Ilium tilted his head. "A signal?" She smiled faintly. "No, a broadcast. Visual, open channel. Undeniable." He understood immediately. They worked together for the next 2 days, adjusting the outpost's transmission arrays, crafting the message she wanted to send. She stood before the lens, wrapped in a mantle of white synth fabric, her skin glowing gently beneath the lights, her voice calm and clear. "I am Nali of Zarel," she said. "I was abandoned on Halsas by Expedition Command. I survived. I was found, not by those sworn to protect me, but by a Terran medic who heard my voice through the storm. I speak now so that none of you can forget. I speak because I endured what you believed unendurable." She paused, her eyes flashed. "And I will not be forgotten again." The message went out across both human and Zarelian networks, carried on shared diplomatic channels, relayed through every system that had ever tuned in to the quiet voices of the broken. They didn't wait for a reply. Nayli had already taken back what mattered, her voice. They stood on the ice shelf at dawn, not speaking. The storm had cleared days ago, and now the world felt almost too quiet, too open. The air was crisp, but not cruel. The snow reflected pale violet light from Halsas' twin moons, casting long shadows behind them as they watched the sky. Far above, a shuttle broke orbit. A diplomatic envoy sent not from her people, but from the independent systems, those who had heard her message and offered assistance. A gesture of respect, a promise of support should she wish to come among them. Not as a victim, but as a guest. Nayli had read every line of the offer, then folded the message and left it on Ilium's desk. "I don't know where I belong now," she had told him, "but I know where I don't." Ilium hadn't replied. He didn't need to. He simply cleared out the northern wing of the outpost, converted the unused lab into a biomech workspace, and left a fresh engineering toolkit on her new bench. Now they stood together in the morning light, two survivors who had nothing in common except for the most important thing. They refused to die quiet deaths. "Do you ever miss Earth?" she asked him softly. He exhaled. "Sometimes. The blue, the noise, the smell of warm dirt." She nodded. "I think I'll miss the silence when I leave." "You don't have to." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. The wind tugged lightly at her hair, lifting strands like threads of starlight. "Are you asking me to stay?" she asked. "I'm not asking anything," he said. "I'm telling you, if you choose this place, I'll stay too." She smiled, Not the brittle smile of someone pretending to be strong, but the slow, knowing curve of someone who had rediscovered choice. I think this world has more use for voices like ours than most. He nodded. Then let's build it. And they did. Not a paradise, not a utopia, but something better. A place where silence no longer meant abandonment. A place where a cry could be answered. A place where the voice of one, screaming into the storm, would always reach another. Together, beneath the rising sky of a world that had tried to kill them both, they built a beginning. Not because it was safe, but because they had earned it.